Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Our guest today is Dr. Seshadri K.S. Seshadri's journey began as a bird watcher in Bangalore. Since then, he has chosen ecology and conservation as a career. He was part of a team that described 3 new species of frogs from India, and he described a new behavior in frogs. Dr. Seshadri is currently a faculty fellow at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Seshadri, welcome and thank you for being part of the podcast.
Hi Shobha, thanks for having me on board.
Seshadri, you are a terrestrial ecologist. What does that mean?
Terrestrial ecologist basically means somebody who studies ecosystems that are not marine or aquatic. Essentially, in ecology, you have 2 groups. One is aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. It's broadly classified as anything that's above ground or on the ground and above it. Although my training has been in ecology for various reasons, one of them being in Bangalore, I don't have access to marine ecosystems, and I ended up studying whatever ecosystems I could find, and those were terrestrial, and that's how it came to be.
So it would be birds would be part of your research and study then.
Yes. Although birds they do fly around, they are in a way terrestrial because they end up nesting on trees or on the ground, and that's the terrestrial link. But I guess the distinction of terrestrial versus aquatic is only important from an ecological point of view, but otherwise we're all ecologists. A marine biologist is no different, just that they know how to scuba dive and I don't. So that's probably the only difference. And they know how to swim and I don't.
You are unusual in that your wingspan, to use a bird metaphor, is wide and it encompasses amphibians, snakes, mongooses, trees, and many others. As you just said, you're an ecologist. So can you place birds in this ecology that you operate in?
I don't know if I'm that unique. A lot of biologists end up studying everything that's fascinating to them, and I think my career in ecology started because I was fascinated by birds. At a very young age, I remember we had a little courtyard and a well in which we had sparrows nesting, and every morning I would go out and spread some rice and sit and watch these sparrows, and there were like hundreds of them. Eventually, one fine day, we were at school and we came back home, and the well was gone and the garden was gone, and there were plans of expanding the house, and it made me sad, and I really wanted the sparrows back. But I guess those experiences somehow led me to continue watching birds. I was in my plus 2, just after my high school. I ended up going for a photography exhibition by Poornachandra Tejaswi. He used to be a writer in Kannada. He's no more. And my mom used to read me stories when I was young that he had written, and it was all about nature, and it was all about adventures with his dog going through the forest. And I guess those experiences kind of forced me into looking at birds. And once you start looking at birds, it opens up a completely new world for you, and you start thinking about all these other things that link with birds, and that's how I ended up being an ecologist. So I would say birds still play a central role in my career as a scientist.
You wrote a paper on parenting in frogs and drew a link to birds. Can you talk about that?
Yes. This is something that's ongoing in the sense that it's still not published, but what we did was to look at frogs, and frogs are incredibly colorful, and there are differences where males are brighter than the females, or the males are completely different colored than the females, and this is something that we call as sexual dichromatism, which is fairly common in birds. If you look at the peacock, it's a great example. The males have a long train of feathers and the females are dull and drab. And in birds, there's a lot of evidence that says it's the female who cares for the offspring, where the female is nesting and sitting on the eggs. The cryptic coloration, as we call it, helps the female in avoiding detection by a predator. In frogs, there's a lot of color going on, right? And in frogs, there's also this behavior called parental care, which is something that I worked on for my PhD, where we found that males in a species of frog that's found in the Western Ghats attend to eggs and guard them inside hollow bamboo internodes. And while thinking about this evolution of this parental care strategy, it just struck me that, hey, look, wait, maybe in frogs also it's something similar that's going on. Maybe it's the cryptic colored frog that guards the eggs, because if you're sitting on the eggs, there are predators that are looking around and eggs take a while to hatch. So it means that you're risking yourself sitting and guarding offsprings, and that's something that we examined. And for this happened during the lockdown. Was I couldn't do fieldwork, so I sat with my computer and looked at thousands of frog pictures and classified color, pattern, and we found that irrespective of who the colorful sex is, they don't seem to. Very few of the colorful ones care for the offspring. That's the finding that we have, and color's got nothing to do with it. So that's the key finding that we have so far. How does it translate to in terms of ecological theory or what we know about the evolution of parental care is something that we are working on now.
Sorry, I was with you till you said color has got nothing to do with it. So I thought
Yeah,
the parallel is that the dull-colored bird, dull-colored frog guards the nest. But
that's what
then,
we expected.
yeah,
That was our expectation,
yes,
that the dull-colored frog was going to sit with the eggs and care. But in very few species that happens. It's not statistically significant. The correlation of these two traits is not really significant, and that was surprising. Which tells us that the frogs must be using some other strategy to overcome predation risk. Like, caregiving is costly. As a parent, it's a costly affair, and they must be overcoming the predation risk by some other means. And in frogs, there's a lot of toxicity that we know. In some frogs, we know some of them are toxic. So maybe frogs use toxins to deter predation. We simply don't know that. So in that sense, something that I learned by watching birds helped us understand a related behavior in frogs, and maybe it'll open up a new field of research, not new field of research, but essentially kind of point a new direction in which we could take amphibian research in. That's where the work stands for now.
and tell us about mistaking a frog for a bird. How did that happen?
Oh, it was a funny incident, and it's also something that kind of uh, put us back in our place. As scientists, we kind of get to this point where we go like, oh yeah, we know about this, we know what we are talking about, and this incident put us in place. This was, I think in the monsoon of 2015. I'd come back to India to do field work, and I was traveling with my colleagues, going and checking out field sites in the Western Ghats where I could start some of my work. And this was near Kumta. We have a friend called C.R. Naik, who used to work with my colleague Gururaj, and we knew Naik from a couple of years ago, and we just dropped by his house and caught up with him, and he was super excited to meet us, and he was showing us the data that he had collected about the presence of frogs in his backyard. He lives along the coast, and the landscape around his house is paddy fields, but some of them are fallow because there's a lot of salt water that comes in and out, and it's basically abandoned land. And he was surveying frogs there, and he played us back a call on his phone saying, I heard this frog. Do you know what it is? And we listened to it, and it sounded like the white-throated kingfisher. We're like, hey, Nayak, don't you really know your birds even? You claim that you study frogs, but you don't even know your birds. And we kind of stopped him, and in a nice way. It was not mean or anything, but he's like, no, 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 sir, this is a frog. Yeah, I mean, we go back a while, so it was okay. We were fooling around, and we had lunch, and we told him that okay, maybe it is a frog, but you should try and get a video recording and all that, and we left. And this fellow goes out the same evening and sends us a video on WhatsApp of the frog calling, and indeed it does sound like the white-breasted kingfisher calling, but it's a frog that's calling, and it had a stump. We were like, what is this frog? Because we worked in that landscape for a while now, and we had never heard anything similar. And even if we had, we probably thought it was a kingfisher and kept quiet. So 2 days later, I was back on a bus, went back to Kumta, and went out with C.R. Nayak. And right behind his house, we found a new population of these frogs, and we got a few samples. We got them back to the lab, and my colleagues helped sequence it. my colleague Preeti, she took the lead on this paper, and she got the DNA data, extracted it, and we plotted it on a phylogenetic tree, which basically tells us which species are related. So if you think of three species in a tree, it tells us which of them are more closely related, this to this or this to this. What we found was that the species that we had was not fitting in with any of the known frogs. So when you have sequences of say 5 species in that genus, you try and compare them, and it gives you percentage difference. And turns out that it didn't fit with any of the known species, and then we had morphological data. So we brought the frog back and we measured them, and there's a bunch of measurements that you take. So things like the snout width, base of the jaw till the tip of the snout to the length of the vent, the forelimb length, the hind limb length, and so on. About 20, 30 different characters that we measure on specimens. And then we compared the numbers statistically with the other known species, which is the pond frog. It's called Euphlyctus hexadactylus. And turns out that there was very clear difference between the two species. And so we ended up describing this new frog as a species novelty or a new species to science. And we called it Euphlyctus karavali. Euphlyctus is the genus, and karavali is the Kannada name for the coastal region. And the reason why we did that was to emphasize the importance of these fallow lands that are very close to the coast. And unfortunately, we don't know enough about this species, but what we do know when we describe the frog was the area where Nayak found this frog has been earmarked for the highway expansion. The West Coast highway that runs along the west coast of India, they are planning to expand it into maybe a monstrous 8-lane highway. So we don't know what's going to happen with the frog, but the idea of naming the frog after the region was to get people to care. I mean, it's got to connect, and people, hey, the frog is named after our landscape, we should do something about it. If nothing else, it will work as blackmail material for us later with bureaucrats to say, hey, look, this frog is named after you, this part of India, and you got to protect it. So that's the strategy. And the biggest takeaway for us from this work was scientists can be mistaken. That's one part. The second part is you don't have to be a scientist to make discoveries. Nayak has no training in biology whatsoever. All his training that he's got is by tagging along with researchers like Gururaj and me. And he is, I think, one of the few people in the forest department who has published a paper, because Nayak was a co-author in this work. He's the second author in this work. So Preeti took the lead, Nayak was the second author, and I think I was the third or the fourth author. And for us, it was an honor to have a non-scientist make this discovery and be a part of the process of formally putting it out there. And that's something that I think Nayak is incredibly proud of. And but there's a lesson for all of us there that not only scientists, anybody can make these discoveries. If you're careful enough to look around you, it's going to happen. It could be anything. It could be birds, it could be frogs, it could be plants.
Birders carry their binoculars and look up all the time. I would imagine that frog people look down all the time. Can you talk about the difference between birders and frog people?
There's a very clear distinction among people who are birders and who are frog people, because it's completely temporally separated. Frog people operate at night. Their day begins at night, and we end up working through the night sometimes into the morning. Whereas bird watchers are completely opposite. They wake up super early, they go out birding, and they come back in the afternoon, and they go out again in the evening. So frog biologists or batrachologists, as they call us, our day begins at night, and it's usually in the thick of the monsoon. Monsoon is when frogs are most active. Frogs are active even in other parts of the year, but monsoon is when they're most active, and it's the easiest to find them because unlike birds, it's typically the males in frogs that vocalize. So each species has its own call, and they vocalize, and it's very easy to find them. And that's, I think, one reason why we end up studying frogs in the monsoon. And what do we carry? A lot of frog biologists, the best thing that we take to the field is a piece of paper and a pencil, because you can write in the rain. People who have a little more money end up buying write in the rain books and specialized pens that you can scribble with it. We carry a camera, obviously, but there's a lot of confusion that if you're if you're taking a camera and photographing frogs, that you're a frog biologist. That misconception is there, because in recent years, at least, I've seen incredible attention being given to frogs by photographers, nature enthusiasts who want to go out there and photograph frogs. And I don't mean it lightly. Many of them have ended up making significant observations, that even new discoveries have been made by amateur naturalists who have gone out and photographing frogs. But a lot of times there's this association that if you're out there with a camera, you're doing research. That's not really the case, because a lot of frog biologists slog it out night after night, wading in the rain, clothes wet, not seeing the sun for like a week. And a lot of it is sitting down there and observing what a frog does. I mean, I study animal behavior, and for me, it's a big challenge, because you have to be there observing it carefully. There can't be an attention lapse. It's like watching an art film. You watch it for 3 hours, nothing happens, and you blink in one scene, and that's the most important scene. And it won't make sense. The movie won't make sense. And with frog behavior, that's what I think happens. And of course, there are these other issues that you need to be mindful about, things like walking into elephants. There have been times when we were doing field work in Kalakkad Mundanthurai Tiger Reserve in Tamil Nadu, where we had to be working in bamboo clumps, and that's where elephants like to hang out. So at times, we would have one field assistant as a sentinel to keep a watch for what is moving around, and they would warn us. And it so happened that one night when I was sampling frogs in the tiger reserve, this was during my master's, and we were in a remote part of the forest where no humans ever go. I mean, except the forest department, nobody goes there. And we were sampling frogs in a stream, and I was about waist deep in the water, and had a bag full of frogs that I had to measure and release them. And my assistant, the sentinel, heard something, and he asked me to stop and look up. He had a big torch, and I look up, and I stare a leopard that's trying to cross the stream, and it's looking right at me from about, say, maybe 8 feet away. And we didn't do anything. There's nothing we could do. So I just froze, and the leopard also froze, and it crouched down, and we stood looking at each other for about a minute. And then I slowly walked back without turning around. And all the while, my assistant was looking at the leopard, and I came onto a rock, and then the leopard walked off. So those are some of the exciting things that we have in the field. There have been, I've walked into leopards a few more times after that, and nothing untoward happened, but there's a very high chance that things can go wrong.
Tell us about your work with wetland birds.
A lot of the work that I've done on birds the formal research has been on wetland birds, but I've uh, I've been watching wetland birds from when I can remember. So because I grew up watching birds, and I started going out to Lalbagh for the BNG Birds bird watching outings, and that's kind of when I also got interested in research. But then that research led me on. I mean, it took me to study insects, it took me to study plants, mammals, and then eventually I circled back to birds, and that's when I did the wetland bird work. And again, it was not really something that I was leading; it was my colleagues who did, really part of the team assisting them with surveying these wetland birds. And to give a bit of a context, we were working in the Kalakkad Mundanthurai Tiger Reserve landscape, which is in the southern part of Tamil Nadu in Tirunelveli district. But the wetland work that we did was in the neighboring Tuticorin district as well. And the reason why we worked in these two districts was the Kalakkad Mundanthurai Tiger Reserve, KMTR as we call it, is home for, I think, seven or at least three rivers, and it has seven reservoirs and three rivers. And one of them is the Tambraparni, which flows across the Tamil Nadu landscape and goes out into the Bay of Bengal. And along its way, it supports hundreds of wetlands, which are essentially reservoirs that have been built centuries ago, connected by a canal network. So we wanted to look at this landscape and see how they support wetland birds. And we know a lot of the wetland birds are migrants, the winter migrants. They come from European the northern parts of the world, and come down south. So we began by surveying all the tanks that are in this landscape. There are some 300 odd tanks that were listed in the panchayat, and we got hold of a list, and we would go out and survey them every day for about 3 months. And our day would start with eating some fresh oil-soaked vadas in a chai shop by the road, and that was it. That was it for the whole day. We'd start our day at like 6 in the morning, I think, and we'd go on a jeep and survey these tanks. A lot of times it was awkward because in this landscape, people use the wetlands for everything from taking bath to taking a dump, and it would be awkward because we would be disturbing people there, but they wouldn't mind. They're like, "Oh, you're watching us, or you're watching birds," and a lot of funny things would happen. And but the birds that we found were fascinating because it was the first time anybody was surveying this landscape for wetland birds. We found as part of the survey, we accidentally ran into a heronry in a place called There's a place called Alvarkurchi where the tank is called Vagaikulam, and one random evening we saw a lot of egrets flying by in one direction, and this is open paddy field landscape and interspersed with palmyra trees, and you can see for a few kilometers. And some of us got onto the jeep and we scanned the horizon with our binoculars, and we saw them landing in one place, and we decided to head in that direction. We turned our compass on and we just went straight to that place. And we found that it was a nice little pond, it was a tank, and with a bunch of trees in the middle in which there were thousands of cattle egrets that were coming into roost, and from all directions. And this we didn't know about this wetland, and we started talking to the villagers, and soon we realized that half the trees in that pond have been cut. The trees were planted as part of a social forestry scheme, and the contract had been given out, and the contractor had cut half the trees. And because it was the monsoon, the lake had filled up with water. He hadn't cut the rest of them. And that's when we were shocked that this was going to go. And we talked to the villagers, and they're like, "Yeah, we like these birds around the waters." They were aware of the benefits of water, and again, these birds will drop the droppings from these birds would enrich the water, and they use it for agriculture, and they knew how important it was, and they didn't really want the birds gone, but they're like, "Hey, look, the contract's been given out. What can we do?" So the same day, we rallied up a bunch of people from the village. We wrote a petition to the district collector, wrote a press release at the wetland itself. One of us had a laptop. So we wrote a press release, called a few media people and said, "Hey, look, you need to protect this wetland." And subsequently, the long story is that now there's a proposal for a community-based conservation reserve put in by the people, but with our support. A-Tree, where I used to work, people from A-Tree, researchers there have helped them conserve this place. The trees haven't been cut. It's been 10 years now, I think. The trees are still there. And every year they do a festival of sorts where they watch birds during the annual waterfall surveys. And so that's one of the discoveries that happened. And we also found several new species for that landscape. So one of the lakes that we surveyed, we ended up sighting a Caspian plover. Honestly, I didn't even know that the bird existed back then. I had to look up in the field guide to identify what it was, and it was the first record from that region. So those are things that they were spin-offs of the bird watching effort that we did, and we ended up publishing a paper identifying key wetlands that ought to be protected, and these were in terms of the existing convention. So, for example, there's something called the Ramsar Convention, which India is a signatory to, which specifies what kind of lakes, what amount of diversity, what richness, all that. Using these metrics, they come up with an index, and you can rank which lake should be conserved or which lake should be focused on more. And so we made a list of, I think, 60 wetlands, and we chose to survey them annually. So the global waterfall census usually happens in January, and we started surveying them, and that eventually led to a larger scheme where a citizen group from Tuticorin joined hands with A-Tree, who's been doing the surveys, and we opened it up for the general public. So every year, I think they get about 100 people who sign up for this survey effort, and they go out, they get a day of training beforehand, and they go out and collect data on birds. So I think, again, it's been going on for about 10 years now. What have we found? We need to look at this data, and I'm not directly part of it now, but it feels nice to know that some of the initial groundwork that we put in has led to this sustained effort later. So Those are some of the, I think these were the fun times that I had in wetlands as well. Lots of adventures, lots of fun during the time.
One question I ask all my guests is what are their favorite birds and why? This may be an opportune time to ask if you have any favorites. Either I know you work with grassland birds as well. We can come to, but
Yes. I don't know though. I can't pick a favorite bird. One of the birds that I have my earliest memories of birds is the tailor bird, or I don't know if it's the ashy wren-babbler. I don't know which one it is, but it used to be the bird that we used to get in front of our house when I had the garden, and I used to call it the bird that shakes its tail in Kannada. So ballad sagubi is what I used to call it. So I don't know if which one of it is. It might be a tailor bird for all I know now. But I think that's one of the birds that I like. Tailor bird or the wren warbler is something that I'm fond of because I think simply because it's got associated memory. Uh, I've also been fascinated about hornbills. I kind of still remember the time that for the first time that I saw the great pied hornbill, and this was somewhere in Sirsi where I was doing surveys on large mammals. I was volunteering for surveys with a NGO, and that's when I heard these birds flying over, and you hear these whooshing sounds that they make as they fly by, and that's one of my favorite birds. In terms of wetland birds, I've had the fortune of working with uh, different groups of researchers, and I've studied some of the. In fact, I've also held a few wetland birds because we're getting trained in ringing birds with the BNHS station in Point Calumet, and each of us got to handle a bird and put a ring on. So plovers are cute. I like plovers. Uh, what else though? I mean, it's really hard for me to pick a favorite bird. I give up.
context is suppose somebody from abroad comes here for a weekend to work
Okay.
in the area which you are, which happens to be Bangalore.
Ah.
What are some birds they should look to see? And if they're sort of in and out.
Well, around Bangalore, again, tailor birds are common. They are found pretty much everywhere. On a busy street to a quieter area like the one that I live in. In terms of what birds they should see, I, I mean, I'm thinking again in terms of the things that they won't be able to see back home. In that sense,
Correct.
huh, we have the darters are there. Darters are again a globally endangered bird. You get them in some of the wetlands here. Dabchicks are something that I like because they're super cute. They disappear into the water. Pygmy cotton teals used to be common around Bangalore. If one gets a chance, I would ask them to go check out certain areas where they can see it. But yeah, those are I think the birds that I would pick on.
That's good enough. Yeah, that's good enough. What are some things about grassland birds that suppose somebody's starting out in birding? Just tell us about them and what should amateur birders know about grassland birds?
Grasslands are a incredibly fascinating habitat, and I have a frog story to tell with the grassland too. I'll come to it later. But with birds, I think not just bird watchers, but I think generally all of us should acknowledge the fact that grasslands are incredibly important. In fact, they are one of the most primitive forms of. There's increasing evidence now that indicates that grasslands have been around for a really long time, a couple of million years ago, and it's unfortunate that the existing policies in our country doesn't consider grasslands as important. In fact, a lot of grasslands are listed in the. If you look at the Wasteland Atlas of India, grasslands form a major part of it. So I think that's an incredibly important step that we need to take. Is even grass is important, and our notion is that it's just grass needs to change. But in terms of for bird watchers, again, there's this over the years that I've interacted with bird watchers, youngsters who want to get into bird watching, there's this notion that you should go to this remote forest somewhere and watch birds, or you should go to Amazon, or you should go to Papua New Guinea. I mean, those places are fantastic, they're great, but look right outside your window, there's a lot of stuff that you can see. And one of the common birds that you get in Bangalore grasslands are the lapwings. You have the yellow-wattled lapwing, which used to be common. I mean, again, growing up, I've heard them fly over my house in Mathikere, close to the Indian Institute of Science. And now they're gone. You don't find them anymore. And in terms of grasslands, I think people ought to visit bigger areas of grassland. So a couple of years ago, I was in Bidar, went on a holiday to Bidar, and a colleague there, Krishnamurthy, took us to a grassland, which was the last remaining patch where he had seen the lesser florican. And lesser floricans, as we know, are a endangered species in India. It's found in the Terai portion of the Brahmaputra Ganges belt and in parts of other parts of India as well. And in fact, there's a report from Bangalore in 2012. Somebody discovered one in Hesarghata after about 130 years. So, so there's a lot of hidden diversity out there, which we end up missing out because we think it's just grass. So that mindset needs to change, and we should, going forward, again, in terms of conserving these landscapes, I think we should respect that grasslands are unique ecosystems and not mess them up with planting trees or something like that. Like the Great Indian Bustard is a great example. We used to have incredible grasslands, and they're now planted with trees, and the bustards can't really survive there. And these are again well-meaning, well-intentioned things that we do, but end up messing up the environment for these kind of birds. And that's my long spiel on grasslands, though.
Are these the cavals that you're talking about?
Some of them. So kavals are basically land, what we also call Gomala land, which was essentially for cattle herders to graze their cattle. And these are cattle herders who are nomadic herding tribes. They would start their year at one place and then they would move with their cattle right across to another place and then go back. So they would traverse this journey, and there's a lot of ethnobiology associated with it in terms of their traditional knowledge, in terms of them keeping track of seasons, observing the landscape, a lot of folklore, a lot of folk songs, all of this sociological aspects of it, if I can call it sociology, is associated with these pastorals. And again linking to pastoralists in Tirunelveli around the landscape. I briefly did some work with the pastoral, the team studying the pastoral community of cattle herders in that region. Again, for the first time, my colleagues there documented the biodiversity in these agricultural landscapes, and documented how quickly they're changing in terms of highways that have bisected this landscape, people who have fenced up this landscape now, which used to be open and now it's fenced up, and slowly these grasslands are getting more and more woody. And in nature, in ecology, there's this concept called ecological succession. So succession is basically the transition of one habitat to another habitat, and typically wetland slowly becomes. I mean, the edges of the wetland slowly have grasslands which expand into wooded areas, and they end up becoming densely wooded habitats. Wetlands around Bangalore, like Hesarghata, have this transition succession landscape where you see water, the edge of the water is grass. As you move away from the water, you slowly see the vegetation, height of the vegetation increasing, and you have woody trees and so on. Unfortunately, the grasslands have been dug up and planted with acacia and all kinds of other native trees, which destroys the habitat for these birds in the sense that the birds that would have occupied this grassland can no more cannot be found there anymore. But of course, we have the birds that occupy the wooded habitats moving in. So there is some transition that happens. Should we actively enable such a transition, or should we let things be? Is something that we all need to reflect upon.
We're reaching the tail end, but is there an issue that you feel passionate about that you would like to talk about? I know you've written about bird photography, for example.
Okay. Again, some of my inspiration for birds or passion for studying birds has been fueled by photography, right? Like I told you about Tejaswi's photo exhibition that triggered me to buy my first field guide on birds and start watching birds on my own. And I think photographers play an incredibly important role in the current scenario where everything, you look around and all you see is all you see are depressing things. That it could be people dying, it could be forest getting burned, it could be some dam bursting open. And I think in this context it's incredibly important that we document what is around us. And although I photograph birds, I don't call myself a photographer, but in this context I'm including myself into the group because I do end up taking pictures when I go out. And some of the things that have upset me is the extent of callousness, if I can use that word, among photographers about their subject. I mean, initially photography was all about at heart they're all passionate about nature. I mean, we all are passionate about nature, but somewhere along the way it takes this ugly turn where it's a hobby done for mileage rather than the benefits of it for the subject. I mean, end of the day, is your subject better or worse than before you looked at it or photographed it or whatever should be the aim. Unfortunately, in Bangalore, there was this, or there is still this practice of photographers chasing birds in their cars and photographing them. Turns out it's a good method because the birds are less scared by cars and they don't fly away faster and they let you approach really close. But unfortunately, what happens is that while you're driving around looking at the bird, you don't know where you're driving. That's one thing. And you're also running amok in this pristine grassland habitat, or what is left of the grassland habitat. And there's a lot of birds that are nesting. There are a lot of other things, that insects and grass or plants that are growing up, which are important for the ecological food chain to function. And in Hesarghetta landscape in 2012, I remember some of us had gone out bird watching, and we had parked our car outside and we were walking along in the grassland, and we saw a bunch of cars chasing something. And with our binoculars, we saw that there was a roller. We thought it was an Indian roller. This bird was being chased by at least 10 different cars, and it was like Hatari, where there's this rhino and there's jeeps chasing it. And we got closer, and turns out that this was a European roller, is a which is a uncommon bird in this parts of the world, where it had come down, I think, because of the wind or whatever. There were people chasing these birds in the car, and yeah, vagrant birds. And I was upset, and I spoke to a few colleagues of mine, saying, "Look, what these fellows are doing is bad, and what can we do?" And we didn't know all these. Some of them, unfortunately, were photographers who I knew. And this colleague of mine said, let's get together and do a study. So we some of us, some of the students from St. Joseph's College where I had studied, I spoke to my professor, and he sent a bunch of students who were interested in this work. And we went there over 2 weekends, and we had a team counting the number of cars, and we had a team. So my cousin and I, we had a handheld GPS. We sat on a motorbike and we traversed all the roads that we could see where vehicles had gone. And we had another team which held a measuring tape and took a photograph so that we could come back and quantify the extent of damage later. And once we did the mapping on the motorbike, we found that there were about I think around 40 kilometers length of path that had been made in the grassland, zigzag everywhere, around trees, away from the water, towards water, all kinds of things. And it was shocking because the Hesarghetta wetland is only about 20 kilometers from the city. So there were more roads in the lake than the roads that from the city to the lake. And with the photographs that we had taken, we were able to show that the vehicle impact was so much that we computed the area of the grassland that was lost by the vehicles passing. And we wrote a white paper and put the report out. And it attracted a lot of attention in the media because it was photographers, right? I mean, photographers often are, I mean, they're liked or disliked. There's no middle path there. And it also led to a lot of discussion where a lot of bird photographers wrote back to us saying, "Oh, thank you. We didn't know that this was an impact." So I think it was a good thing that we did what we did instead of going offensive all out. The report was moderate, or it was made people made me write a moderate report. The language was carefully chosen. If I had done it, I would have done it in a very harsh way. But so what it led to, as part of the report, we put on a list of suggestions that included fencing off the place and digging trenches along the roads so that cars couldn't go over. And a couple of years later, we now realize that the BWSSB, whose control the Hesarghattal area is, the water body is, they have fenced the whole place, and there's one gate, and cars are no longer allowed inside. So if you have to go watch birds, you have to walk, and it's a good thing, because when you're walking, you're less impactful. You're looking where you're going, and yes, of course, birds will tend to fly away, but these days photographers have fancy lenses that are close to 1000 mm, I think. So I think that's a good thing that has happened. Hopefully, in other parts of the country where such impacts are there, maybe local people there could take up the effort to put such effort and show photographers. I mean, they're after all our friends. We're not against them at all, and it's just bringing some ecological science into photography. And circling back to the advice that you asked if I could give, I would say the bird takes priority. The well-being of the animal is the topmost priority. It's okay if you don't photograph. I mean, it's okay if you don't get the best photograph. We all know it is just going to sit in our hard disk forever. It's not going to be useful forever. The other things photographers can do, and again, some of the photographers in Bangalore I know have been doing it, is giving out these pictures with a Creative Commons license, or putting them up on Wikipedia. I think growing up as a bird watcher, the first thing I would do is look it up on the internet. And if a Wikipedia article doesn't have photograph of a bird, you're losing a potential bird watcher in the future. So I think photographers are in a position to leverage this support, or leverage their skills and get rally up support for birds and broadly nature.
Yeah. One of our guests, M.B. Krishna, said that these were not his words, but essentially he was saying, why don't you just go out in nature and enjoy it instead of photographing
Absolutely.
it? Or his theory was that nature is an experience to be felt, not to
Yes.
be, chased or anything.
Yep. I
And
absolutely agree. Sorry, go ahead.
one of our other guests, Seshadri, which may interest you in this regard, her name is Sai Montgomery, and
Uh-huh.
she has written a book on the California condors. And
Oh, okay.
basically, what they did was discovered that the condors were dying because they ate carrion, or they were not dying because of diclofenac like our vultures, but
Mhm.
because hunters were shooting in the Grand Canyon, in the California condor country, and the lead bullets left a trail which, when the condor eats, it would poison them. So
Yep.
then they converted the hunters by saying, you too love nature. Why can't you use copper bullets? And now California has outlawed lead bullets. And so,
Yeah. No, I think it's absolutely important that we are mindful about nature when we are out there. With cameras and with these days of, social media fanfare, it's very easy to lose that original reason why we went out into nature, right? I mean, all these photographers started out with observing nature or enjoying the experience. Somewhere along the way, we lose our path, and I think we shouldn't. We should consciously guard ourselves with this notion that, look, nature is important, and there's a lot that we can learn by being mindful. It could be anywhere. I could be sitting in a park and observe something and find a new thing that hasn't been seen before. So I think that aspect is incredibly important, and I'm sure other speakers that you have spoken to would agree with what Krishna said.
absolutely. Thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and EcoEdu. This episode has been edited by Tamanna Atreya. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for listening. For those who would like to listen to Seshadri speak in Kannada, please continue. The rest of you can stop right here. Thank you.
I'll speak in Kannada. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ, ನನ್ನ ಹೆಸರು ಶೇಷಾದ್ರಿ ಅಂತ. ನಾವು ಮೂಲತಃ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನವನು. ಚಿಕ್ಕ ವಯಸ್ಸಲ್ಲೇ ನಾನು ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭಿಸಿದೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆ ಮುಂದೆ ಒಂದು ಸಣ್ಣದಾದ ಒಂದು ಗಾರ್ಡನ್ ಇತ್ತು. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಬಾವಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಗುಬ್ಬಚ್ಚಿಗಳು, ಈಗ ಬಹುಶಃ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಗದೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಗುಬ್ಬಚ್ಚಿಗಳಿದ್ವು. ದಿನ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಎದ್ದು ನಾನು ಅವುಗಳಿಗೆ ಅಕ್ಕಿ ಹಾಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೆ. ಆಗ ಸುಮಾರು ಒಂದು 100ರಿಂದ 150 ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಬಂದು ಅಕ್ಕಿ ತಿಂತಾ ಇದ್ವು. ಸೊ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ನನಗೆ ಪಕ್ಷಿ ವೀಕ್ಷಣೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂಚೂರು ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಹುಟ್ಕೊಂತು ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ. ಹಂಗೆ ಮುಂದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ನಾನು ಪಕ್ಷಿಗಳಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರಾಣಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೂ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಇತ್ತು. ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನನಗೆ ಪೂರ್ಣಚಂದ್ರ ತೇಜಸ್ವಿ ಅವರ ಕಥೆಗಳನ್ನ ಓದಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ತೇಜಸ್ವಿ ಅವ್ರು ನೀವು ಕೇಳಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅವರು ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅಥವಾ ಪರಿಸರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬರಿತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನ ಆ ಕಥೆಗಳನ್ನ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ನನ್ನ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಬೆಳೀತಾ ಹೋಯ್ತು. ಹಂಗೆ ಬೆಳೆದ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ನಾನು ಇವಾಗ ಪರಿಸರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನನಗೆ ಆಲೋಚನೆ ಬಂತು. ಅದನ್ನೇ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಸೊ ಈಗ ಸದ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ನಾನು ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಪರಿಸರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ನಡೆಸ್ತೀನಿ. ಈಗ ನಾನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರೋ ಕೆಲಸ ಕಪ್ಪೆಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ ಆದ್ರೂ ನನಗೆ ಪಕ್ಷಿ ವೀಕ್ಷಣೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಆಸಕ್ತಿ ಇದೆ. ಯಾವಾಗ ಅವಕಾಶ ಸಿಗುತ್ತೋ ಅವಾಗ ಹೋಗಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ತೀನಿ ನಾನು. ಈಗ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ತಾ ಇರೋ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಕಪ್ಪೆಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನು ಪಕ್ಷಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ನಡೆಸಕ್ಕೆ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನ ಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಸುಮಾರು ಒಂದು 7-8 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ ಏಟ್ರಿ ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಂಸ್ಥೆ ಇದೆ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಕ್ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದೆ. ತಮಿಳುನಾಡಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಟೀಮ್ ಒಂದಿತ್ತು. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪುರಾತನ ಕಾಲದ ಕೆರೆಗಳು ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ನಾವು, ನದಿ ಸುತ್ತಲೂ ಕೆರೆಗಳು ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ನೀವು ನೋಡಿರ್ಬೋದು. ತಿರುನಲ್ವೇಲಿ ಅನ್ನೋ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಭತ್ತ ಬೆಳೆಯುವಂತ ಜಾಗ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತಾಮ್ರಪರ್ಣಿ ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ನದಿ ಇದೆ. ಆ ನದಿ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಸುಮಾರು 300 ಕೆರೆಗಳನ್ನ ಕಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸುಮಾರು 100-150 ವರ್ಷ ಹಳೆಯದು. ಚೋಳರು ಆಳ್ತಿದ್ದ ಕಾಲದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಿದಂತ ಕೆರೆಗಳಿದೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ಈ ತರ ಜೌಗು ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಕೆರೆ ದಂಡೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಗುವಂತ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ಯಾರು ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ಮಾಡಿರ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಒಂದು 4 ಜನ ಸೇರಿ ದಿನ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು 4 ಎಣ್ಣೆಲಿ ಕರೆದಿದ್ದು ವಡೆ ತಿಂದು ಜೀಪ್ ಹತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವು. ಕೆರೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ನಾವು ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ಎಣಿಸ್ಬೇಕಿತ್ತು. ಸೊ 3 ಜನ 3 ದಿಕ್ಕಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ, 4 ಜನ ಇದ್ವು ಡ್ರೈವರ್ನು ಸೇರಿ, 4 ಜನ 4 ದಿಕ್ಕಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ 4 ದಿಕ್ಕಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ಎಣಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವು. ಹೀಗೆ ಎಣಿಸ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಆ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದುವರೆಗೂ ಸಿಗದೇ ಇರುವಂತ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಸಿಕ್ಕಿತ್ತು ನಮ್ಗೆ. ಅದು ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಒಂದು ಹೆರನ್ರಿ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು. ನೀವು ರಂಗನತಿಟ್ಟು ಕೇಳಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದವ್ರಿಗೆ ರಂಗನತಿಟ್ಟು ಪರಿಚಯ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಮರದ ಮೇಲೆ ಕೂತು ಗೂಡು ಕಟ್ಟಿ ಮರಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಹೋಗುವಂತ ಜಾಗ. ಒಂದು ಕೆರೆ ಹೆಸರು, ಅದ್ರ ಹೆಸರು ವಾಗೈಕುಳಂ ಅಂತ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡುದು ಒಂದ್ ಸಂಜೆ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಅದನ್ನ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ನೋಡಕ್ ಹೋದಾಗ ಈ ಕೆರೆ ಸಿಕ್ತು ನಮ್ಗೆ. ಆ ಕೆರೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಮರಗಳಿತ್ತು. ಅರ್ಧ ಕೆರೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತ್ರ ಮರ ಇತ್ತು, ಮಿಕ್ಕಿದ ಅರ್ಧ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡ್ದಿದ್ರು. ಹಳ್ಳಿಯವ್ರನ್ನ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡಿಸಿ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗ, ಇಲ್ಲ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಗುತ್ತಿಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರು ಬಂದು ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್ರಿನವ್ರು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರು ಬಂದು ಕಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ, ಮಳೆಗಾಲ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಕಡಿತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಅಯ್ಯೋ, ಇಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಗೂಡು ಕಟ್ಟಿ ಇದ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಸಾವಿರಾರು ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳಿತ್ತು. ನೀವು ಬಕಪಕ್ಷಿ ಅಂತ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಹೆರನ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಅಂತವು. ಸುಮಾರು ಒಂದು 10,000 ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಇದ್ವು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಎಣಿಸಿದ್ದ, ನನಗೆ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇರೋ ಹಂಗೆ. ಅದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನಿಲ್ಸೋದಕ್ಕೆ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಮೀಡಿಯಾದವ್ರಿಗೆ ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿ, ಪ್ರೆಸ್ ರಿಲೀಸ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟು, ಮತ್ತೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಡಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಟ್ ಕಲೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಏನಿರ್ತಾರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿಸಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಕಡಿಬೇಡಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಕ್ಯಾಂಪೇನ್ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ವು. ಈಗ ಅದ್ರ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಏನಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಮರಗಳ ಹಂಗೆ ಉಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೆ. ಹಳ್ಳಿಯವರು ನಮಗೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಬೆಂಬಲ ಕೊಟ್ಟರು. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಈ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮರದಲ್ಲಿ ಗೂಡು ಮಾಡಿ ಹಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹಾಕಿದಾಗ ಆ ಹಿಕ್ಕೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು ನ್ಯೂಟ್ರಿಯೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಅದಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಅಗ್ರಿಕಲ್ಚರಿಗೆ ಅದು ತುಂಬಾ ಉಪಯೋಗ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಹಳ್ಳಿಯವ್ರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿತ್ತು, ಆ ನೀರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಭತ್ತ ಬೆಳೆದ್ರೆ ಭತ್ತದ ಬೆಳೆ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ನಾವು ಫರ್ಟಿಲೈಸರ್ ಅಥವಾ ಕೆಮಿಕಲ್ಸ್ ಏನ್ ಹಾಕ್ತಿವಿ ಅದು ಅಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಬೇಕಾಗಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಅವ್ರು ನಮ್ಮ ಸಪೋರ್ಟಿಗೆ ಜೊತೆಲಿ ನಿಂತು, ಅವರು ಈ ಕನ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಅಂತ ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಈ ಪ್ರಪೋಸಲ್ಗೆ ಭಾಗಿಯಾದ್ರು. ಆ ಪ್ರಪೋಸಲ್ ಇನ್ನೂ ಅಪ್ರೂವ್ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಬಟ್ ಆ ಪ್ರಪೋಸಲ್ ಇನ್ನೂ ಇದೆ, ಸರ್ಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆ ಅದು. ಸೊ ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ಮರಗಳು ಉಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದೆ. ಇದೇ ನಮ್ಮ ವೆಟ್ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಸುತ್ತಮುತ್ತಲು, ವೆಟ್ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಜೌಗು ಪ್ರದೇಶ ಅಂತ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನ್ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ, ಇದ್ರ ಸುತ್ತಲೂ ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲು ಪ್ರದೇಶ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಇದಲ್ದೇನೂ ಬೇರೆ ಕಡೆನೂ ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲು ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ನೀವು ಉತ್ತರ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಕಡೆ ಹೋದ್ರೆ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬೀದರ್ ಅಥವಾ ರಾಯಚೂರು ಅಂತ ಕಡೆ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ತುಂಬಾನೇ ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲು ಪ್ರದೇಶಗಳಿದೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಪರಿಸರ ಪ್ರೇಮದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕಾಡು ಅಥವಾ ಮರ ಗಿಡ ಇದ್ದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತ್ರ ಪರಿಸರ ಇರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಭಾವಿಸ್ಕೋತೀವಿ ಹೊರತು ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲನ್ನ ನಾವು ಪರಿಗಣಿಸಲ್ಲ. ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲುಗಳು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಅಮೂಲ್ಯವಾದಂತ ಜಾಗಗಳು. ಇವುಗಳು ಮಿಲಿಯನ್ ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ ಈ ಭೂಮಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಇರುವಂತ ಜಾಗಗಳಾದ್ರೂ ಬರೀ ಹುಲ್ಲೆ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ರೂ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಬಯೋಡೈವರ್ಸಿಟಿ, ಜೀವ ವೈವಿಧ್ಯತೆ ಅಂತ ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ಅದಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳಾಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಹುಳ ಹುಟ್ಟೆ ಆಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಹೀಗೆ ಸುಮಾರು ಲೈಫ್ ಫಾರ್ಮ್ಸ್ ಏನಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅದು ಸಿಗುವಂತ ಜಾಗ. ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲು ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಹೆಸರುಘಟ್ಟ ಅಂತ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆ. ಈ ಹೆಸರುಘಟ್ಟ ಸುತ್ತಮುತ್ತಲು ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲು ಇದ್ದ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಗಿದೆ, ನಾವು ಮರ ಬೆಳೆಸಿದ್ರೆ ಕಾಡು, ಮರ ಬೆಳೆಸಿದ್ರೆ ಪರಿಸರಕ್ಕೆ ಒಳ್ಳೇದು ಅಂತ ತಗೊಂಡೋಗಿ ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲು ಕಡ್ದು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮರ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮರ ಹಾಕೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳಿಗೇನೋ ಉಪಯೋಗ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ಬಟ್ ಈ ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲಲ್ಲೇ ಸಿಗ್ಬೇಕಾದಂತ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಆಗತ್ತೆ. ಈ ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ಏನು ಹ್ಯಾಬಿಟ್ಯಾಟ್ ಅಂತ ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ ನಾವು, ಅದರಲ್ಲೇ ಇರುವಂತ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಇನ್ನೂ ಕಾಣಿಸಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಸರುಘಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ. ಅದು ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಹೆಸರುಘಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಇತ್ತೀಚೆಗೆ ಒಂದು ಸುಮಾರು 5ರಿಂದ 10 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ ವೈಲ್ಡ್ ಲೈಫ್ ಫೋಟೋಗ್ರಾಫರ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಏನ್ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಛಾಯಾಚಿತ್ರ ತೆಗೆಯೋರು ಹೋಗಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗಿತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಅಲ್ಲಿ. ಬಟ್ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗೆಯೋ ಸಂಭ್ರಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರ ಕಾರುಗಳನ್ನೇ ಒಳಗೆ ತಗೊಂಡು ಹೋಗಿ ಎಲ್ಲಂದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಕಾರಲ್ಲೇ ಕೂತು ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳನ್ನ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗಿಯಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಇದರಿಂದ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ಹಕ್ಕಿ ಹಾರೋಗೋ ಸಂಭವ ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಆಗತ್ತೆ. ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಕಾರ್ ಕಂಡ್ರೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಹೆದರಲ್ಲ, ನಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋದ್ರೆ ಹೆದರಿ ಹಾರೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಕಾರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ಉಪಯೋಗನೇ, ಬಟ್ ಕಾರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲ್ ಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ವಾಹನ ಚಲಿಸೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳು ಮೊಟ್ಟೆ ಇಟ್ಟಿರುತ್ತವೆ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹುಳ ಹುಟ್ಟೆ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಅಥವಾ ಸಣ್ಣ ಸಸಿಗಳು ಬರ್ತಾ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಇದೆಲ್ಲಾನು ನಾಶ ಆಗಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಹುಲ್ಲುಗಾವಲಲ್ಲಿರುವಂತ ಮಣ್ಣು ಏನಿದೆ, ಸಾಯಿಲ್ ಕಂಪ್ಯಾಕ್ಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ, ಅದು ಗಟ್ಟಿ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಗಟ್ಟಿ ಆದಾಗ ನಿಮಗೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೇ ಗಿಡಗಳದ್ದು ಬೀಜ ಬಿದ್ರೂ ಅದು ಚಿಗುರಲ್ಲ. ಅವಾಗ ಅದೇನಾಗ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ, ಬರಡಾಗ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ ಭೂಮಿ. ಇದರಿಂದ ಮಣ್ಣು ಕೊಚ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗೋ ಸಂಭವ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ. ಕೆರೆನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಣ್ಣು ತುಂಬ್ಕೊಳುತ್ತೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಕೆರೆ ತುಂಬ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ನೀರೇ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಇಂಥದ್ದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಸಂಶೋಧನೆ ನಡೆಸಿದ್ವು ಕೆಲವು ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ. ಈ ಸಂಶೋಧನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಾರುಗಳು ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ, ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಿಲೋಮೀಟರ್ ಗಟ್ಟಲೆ ರಸ್ತೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಆ ರಸ್ತೆ ಹೋಗಿರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಎಷ್ಟು ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲು ನಾಶ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನಾವು ಅಳತೆ ಮಾಡಿ ಒಂದು ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವು. ಮೀಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೂ, ಫಾರೆಸ್ಟ್ ಡಿಪಾರ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗೂ ಒಂದು ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಕಳಿಸಿದ್ವು ನಾವು. ಇದರಿಂದ ಕೆಲವು ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಇಂಟರ್ವೆನ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಒಂದೇನಪ್ಪಾ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಈಗ ಕೆರೆ ಸುತ್ತಲೂ ಕಾಂಪೌಂಡ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಸೊ ಕಾರುಗಳು ಒಳಗೆ ಹೋಗೋಂಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಎರಡನೇದು, ಒಂದು ಕನ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಅಂತ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು ಈ ಜಾಗನ ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಪೋಸಲ್ ಕೆಲವರು ಸೇರಿ, ನಾನು ಮತ್ತೆ ಇನ್ನಿಬ್ರು ಸೇರಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವು. ಇದು ಸರ್ಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ 2013ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ವು. ಅದು ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ವೈಲ್ಡ್ ಲೈಫ್ ಬೋರ್ಡ್ ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ಕಮಿಟಿ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಪ್ರೂವಲ್ಗೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಅದಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಅದನ್ನ ಸ್ಯಾಂಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಈ ಕನ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನಪ್ಪಾ, ಜನರಿಗೆ ತೊಂದರೆ ಆಗತ್ತಾ? ಈ ಕನ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಅನ್ನೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಜನರಿಗೆ ಏನು ತೊಂದರೆ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಬೇಸ್ಡ್ ಕನ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಮ ವೈಲ್ಡ್ ಲೈಫ್ ಪ್ರೊಟೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ರೀಸೆಂಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಬಂದಂತ ಒಂದು ಸೌಲಭ್ಯ ಇದು. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ಈಗ ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲಿರೋದು ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲಾಗಿ ಉಳಿಸ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದಷ್ಟೇನೆ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಈಗ ಕುರಿ ಮೇಯಿಸೋರಿಗೇನು ಕುರಿ ಮೇಯಿಸೋದನ್ನ ತಡೆಯೋದಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಉದಾಹರಣೆಗೆ ನೀವು ನಾಗರಹೊಳೆ ಅಥವಾ ಬಂಡೀಪುರ ಅಂತ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಕಿಗೆ ತಗೊಂಡ್ರೆ, ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕುರಿ ಮೇಯಿಸೋದಾಗ್ಲಿ ದನ ಮೇಯಿಸೋದಾಗ್ಲಿ ನಿಷೇಧ ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಈ ಕನ್ಸರ್ವೇಷನ್ ರಿಸರ್ವ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತ ನಿಷೇಧ ಇದೇನು ಇರಲ್ಲ, ಅಬ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಏನು ಇರಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಲೋಕಲ್ ಜನ ಅದನ್ನ ಏನಕ್ಕೆ ಉಪಯೋಗಿಸ್ಕೊತಾ ಇದ್ರೋ ಹಂಗೆ ಉಪಯೋಗಿಸ್ತಾ ಹೋಗ್ಬೋದು. ಬಟ್ ಹುಲ್ಗಾವಲಿರೋದನ್ನ ತಗೊಂಡೋಗಿ ನಾನು ಬಿಲ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಕಟ್ತೀನಿ ಇದ್ರೆ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಇದು ಈ ಪ್ರಪೋಸಲ್ 2ನೇ ಬಾರಿ ಹಿಯರಿಂಗ್ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು ಕೆಲವೇ ತಿಂಗಳ ಹಿಂದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಆ ಹಿಯರಿಂಗ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇದನ್ನ ಅಪ್ರೂವಲ್ ಕೊಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ಈಗ ನನಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿರೋ ಹಂಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಜನ ಸೇರಿ ಇದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರೊಟೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಸಲುವಾಗಿ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಶನ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ನಾವು ಮಾಡಿದ್ದ ಸರ್ವೆಗಳಿಂದ ಇಷ್ಟೆಲ್ಲ ಒಳ್ಳೇದು ಆಗೋ ಸಂಭವ ಇದೆ. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಯಾಕಪ್ಪ ಆಯ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ನಮ್ಮ ಫೋಟೋಗ್ರಫರ್ಸ್ ಹೋಗಿ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗಿತಾ ಇದ್ರು. ಫೋಟೋಗ್ರಫಿ ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಮ್ಮ ಹಾಬಿ. ಇದು ನಮ್ಮ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಏನು, ಪರಿಸರನ ಎಂಜಾಯ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಥವಾ ಪರಿಸರನ ನೋಡಿ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದು. ಬಟ್ ನಾವು ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ರಾ ಹಿಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋದಾಗ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಕೆಲವೊಮ್ಮೆ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗಿಯೋದೇ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಆಗೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಪರಿಸರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಇರೋ ಕಾಳಜಿ ಆಗ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ನಮ್ಮ ಪರಿಸರ ಉಳಿಸ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಆಗ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಕಳೆದೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ನಾವು ಬರೀ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗೆದು ಅದನ್ನ ಸೋಷಿಯಲ್ ಮೀಡಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಕೋದಾಗ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಂಪ್ಯೂಟರ್ ತಂದು ತುಂಬಿಸಿಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಾಗ್ಲಿ ಆಗೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಇದರಿಂದ ಏನು ಉಪಯೋಗಕ್ಕೆ ಬರಲ್ಲ. ನನ್ನ ಫೋಟೋಗ್ರಫರ್ಸಿಗೆ ನಾನೇನಾದ್ರು ಉಪದೇಶ ಕೊಡೋಷ್ಟು ನಾನೇನು ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಬಟ್ ಉಪದೇಶ ಕೊಡೋದಿದ್ರೆ ಒಂದು ನಾ ಏನಪ್ಪ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ, ನಿಮ್ಮ ಫೋಟೋಗಳು ತೆಗ್ದಿರೋ ಫೋಟೋಗಳನ್ನ ಪರಿಸರಕ್ಕೆ ಹಾನಿ ಆಗದೆ ಇರೋ ಅಂತ ತೆಗೀರಿ. ಹಕ್ಕಿಗಳಾಗ್ಲಿ, ಗಿಡ ಆಗ್ಲಿ, ಹುಳ ಹುಟ್ಟೆ ಆಗ್ಲಿ, ಮುಖ್ಯವಾದ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಇರೋದು ಅದರ ವೆಲ್ ಬೀಯಿಂಗ್ ಮೇಲೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಒಳ್ಳೇದಾಗಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋ ಉದ್ದೇಶದಿಂದ ತಾನೇ ನೀವು ನೇಚರ್ನ ಫೋಟೋಗ್ರಫಿ ಮಾಡಕ್ ಹೋಗ್ತೀರಾ. ಗಿಡನ ಡಿಸ್ಟರ್ಬ್ ಮಾಡೋದಾಗ್ಲಿ ಅಥವಾ ಒಂದು ಹಕ್ಕಿ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗಿಯಕ್ಕೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಕಲ್ಲು ಹೊಡೆಯೋದಾಗ್ಲಿ ಆ ಥರದ್ದು ಮಾಡಬೇಡಿ. ಅನ್ಎಥಿಕಲ್ ಪ್ರಾಕ್ಟೀಸಸ್ ಅಂತ ಕರೀತಾರೆ. ಎರಡನೇದು, ನಿಮ್ಮ ಫೋಟೋಗಳು ತೆಗೆದು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕಂಪ್ಯೂಟರ್ ತುಂಬಿಸಿಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಏನೂ ಪ್ರಯೋಜನ ಇಲ್ಲ. ವಿಕಿಪೀಡಿಯಾ ಅಂತ ಕಡೆ ಹಾಕಿ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಫೋಟೋ ತೋರಿಸಿ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಇನ್ಸ್ಪೈರ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ಈ ಥರದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಎಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಜನ ರಿಸರ್ಚರ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಫೋಟೋಸ್ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, ಅಂತವ್ರು ಕೇಳಿದಾಗ ಖಂಡಿತವಾಗಿ ಕೊಡಿ. ಅದರಿಂದ ದುಡ್ಡು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಇದ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಅದು ಬೇರೆ ವಿಷಯ. ಬಟ್ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಉದ್ದೇಶ ಬರೀ ಫೋಟೋ ತೆಗೆದು ಅದನ್ನ ಎಂಜಾಯ್ ಮಾಡೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಪರಿಸರದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಿಮಗಿರೋ ಆಸಕ್ತಿನ ಬೇರೆಯವರಿಗೆ ಹಂಚೋದಾದ್ರೆ ಫೋಟೋಗಳನ್ನ ಶೇರ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ಅದನ್ನ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೂರ್ಬೇಕು. ನನ್ನ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನ ಕೇಳಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ನಿಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.